Emergency landing in Bangkok after hitting severe turbulence. Dozens of people injured, some really terrible injuries. One man died of a cardiac event, and researchers say the turbulence is becoming more severe as climate change heats up the planet. The jet stream said to be 15% stronger than it was in the 1970s, and significant turbulence now happening about 5,500 times each year. The heating, say the researchers, makes the jet stream more volatile and difficult as well to predict. Back to you.
Great news to end on. That's going to do it for me today. Deadline White House starts right now.
Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in the East. The decision by the Supreme Court that now, after yesterday, American presidents can legally function as kings is a clarifying moment for everyone in what friend of the show Sarah Longwell describes as the single largest voting coalition in American politics. And that would be the anti-Trump voters, our coalition. Now, the dangers of a second Trump term loom larger than at any other moment that has come before this. Now that the conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court has made it clear and made it official that the judiciary will not stand in the way of Donald Trump's autocratic intentions. And the plans by Trump and his allies are not rumors, they're not innuendo, they're not left-wing delusions, they're not even based on Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporting on conversations happening behind closed doors. They're out in the public. They're laid out for everyone to see. Trump's promise to weaponize the Justice Department and the justice system is broadcast nearly daily by Trump himself. Just hours before the court's ruling in Trump versus the United States, Trump called for more than 12 of his critics to be imprisoned. On that, the Times reports this, quote, one post that he circulated on Sunday singled out Liz Cheney and called for her to be prosecuted by a type of military court reserved for enemy combatants and war criminals. A separate post included photos of 15 former and current elected officials that said in all capital letters, quote, they should be going to jail on Monday, not Steve Bannon. Those officials included Mr. Biden, Ms. Harris, Mr. Pence, Mr. Schumer, and Mr. McConnell, the top leaders in the Senate, and Representative Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker. Now, to really get our arms around how much more power a reelected, return to the White House Donald Trump would have to act on those tweets and those threats, we only have to look back to what he tried to do in his first term. His first term, he was largely stopped or slowed by his own White House attorneys. We know that back in 2018, his White House counsel at the time, Don McGahn, had to dissuade Trump from ordering Hillary Clinton and Jim Comey to be prosecuted. Here's what the New York Times reported at the time, quote, Donald McGahn rebuffed the president, saying that he had no authority to order a prosecution. McGahn said that while he could request an investigation, that too could prompt accusations of abuse of power. To underscore his point, McGahn had White House lawyers write a memo for Mr. Trump warning that if he asked law enforcement to investigate his rivals, he could face a range of consequences, including possible impeachment. Now, fast forward just a few years, it felt like 13 years. White House attorneys, Pat Cipollone and Eric Hirschman, stood in the way from the January 6 hearings, it sounds like physically at some point, to block Trump's coup attempt. They warned of the legal perils should Trump barrel ahead with trying to overturn an election he lost. So now consider how he woke up today, not just feeling empowered, but being empowered, and how he would feel if reelected, knowing that the 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court, 3 of whom he handpicked, have ruled that presidents have, quote, absolute immunity for anything deemed a core constitutional function and the presumption of immunity for anything else that can be deemed an official act. One expert telling the Washington Post this, quote, if a future president sitting in the Oval Office were to want to commit crimes up to and including subverting an election or remaining in power against the will of the American people, this opinion, in my mind, could provide a roadmap for that. Yesterday's decision by the Supreme Court leaves the American people with only one option. We're down to one option, guys. No one's coming to save us. And that is this, imposing political accountability for the man who tried to overturn the election and now seeks to wreck the pillars of our democracy. Here's how President Joe Biden put it last night.
the American people have to render a judgment about Donald Trump's behavior. The American people must decide whether Donald Trump's assault on our democracy on January 6th makes him unfit for public office in the highest office in the land. The American people must decide if Trump's embrace of violence to preserve his power is acceptable. Perhaps most importantly, the American people must decide if they want to entrust the president once again, the presidency, to Donald Trump, now knowing he'll be even more emboldened to do whatever he pleases whenever he wants to do it.
What the Supreme Court's ruling on immunity means for the choice between democracy and autocracy facing every voter in this country in the 2024 presidential election is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. National investigative reporter for The Washington Post, Carol Leonnig, is back with us. Plus, former U.S. Attorney, MSNBC legal analyst Barbara McQuaid is here. Former Republican Congressman and MSNBC political analyst David Jolly is back with us. Carol Leonnig, a lot of this is your body of reporting from the great books you wrote with the great Phil Rucker. A lot of it is ground that we covered on this show as it was happening. But when you re-examine Trump's affinity for criminal acts and his constant sort of cognizance of the power of the pardon for himself and the people he was asking to engage in conduct, that even he had this reptilian sense to where he might be criminal. How do you sort of reevaluate some of the biggest crises you covered in light of the Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, Nicolle, I'm so glad you hearkened back to some of that reporting, both by the Times and the Washington Post and myself and Phil, because to me, there were moments where Donald Trump was looking to protect himself despite his own instincts about what he wanted to do. He listened to Don McGahn, his White House counsel, even though he was pounding the table at the time in frustration when he wanted to have Jim Comey, his former FBI director, investigated and imprisoned, when he wanted Hillary Clinton, one of his nemesis, to be also investigated and hopefully, in his view, convicted in a trial. It seems to me that all of those guardrails that we talked about as being at least a delaying mechanism, or in some cases an actual stop, those are now lifted entirely. The immunity decision by the 6-3 decision of the Supreme Court basically says that the burden is dramatically on the prosecutor to show how these are not official acts. The president, back in former President Donald Trump, but back in 2019 and 2020, wanted to accomplish some things at the border. In addition to weaponizing his Justice Department, which he also sought to do but held back from, he also wanted to show how tough he was on the border. And when his Secretary of Homeland Security said, "What you're asking me to do is illegal, I cannot bar people from seeking asylum in this country," the president's reaction was, "Well, I'll just pardon you. Go ahead and do it." Now, those people did not want to face criminal liability. They'll have less arguing with Donald Trump in the future. They'll have less opportunity to say this is criminal, because it's a really open question. If the president wants to achieve something, including hanging on to power, showing that he's tough, taking out a rival that he believes or can argue is a national security threat, who's going to stop him exactly? What threat faces him? And what argument can his secretaries of defense, Homeland Security, or Justice make to him? There's very little left.
You know, I was also thinking of all the fantastic reporting about the period around the protests after the murder of George Floyd. And some of the most incredible things that came out were about Defense Secretary Mark Esper and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley pushing back against Stephen Miller's suggestion to use the Insurrection Act. I mean, some of the backstops against Trump's impulses, Carol, were that things were, you know, what the military leaders would say is we wouldn't follow an illegal order. I mean, this sort of recasts what is an illegal order if a president has absolute immunity for criminal acts that he deems official.
Yes, as Justice Jackson asked in oral arguments, and Sotomayor as well. Well, couldn't SEAL Team 6 be instructed by the president on his argument that it's protective of national security to execute a rival? What would stop that exactly? And let's be clear, Nicole, you've brought a real spotlight to this. Donald Trump has said that former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, who rebutted and blocked Trump from some of his worst instincts in his final year in the presidency when he was trying to hold power, trying to use the military to that end. Trump has said that Milley would normally face potential execution for his quote-unquote treason against the Trump administration. Now, that all sounds insane, right, to anybody who understands the rule of law. But that's been Donald Trump's argument. And if he can say, I now, as the newly reelected 46th president of the United States, believe that the former chairman is a danger and a threat to this country, so how is that not an official act if he commands SEAL Team 6 to do it?
I also want to retread some history with you, Barbara McQuaid. I mean, this is out today in the Washington Post. Former Nixon White House counsel John Dean said Monday that had the court's ruling been enforced in the early 1970s, history could have turned out very differently. Quote, as I looked at it, I realized Richard Nixon would have had a pass because the evidence against him was based on official acts the Supreme Court has deemed immune from prosecution. I mean, you can almost erect an alternate history, right? I mean, this is an extraordinary fork in the road for everyone in this country, everyone who I think if they knew much about or they knew a lot or they knew a little about the Constitution, they knew that one of our values was that no one was above the rule of law. After yesterday, one person is, the American president.
Yeah, and, you know, when the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, what they're saying is this is what it said all along. This is what the Founding Fathers meant when they wrote this more than 200 years ago. That certainly wasn't the understanding, however, during the Watergate era. As you know, Nicole, a big part of that case was the allegations that Richard Nixon had ordered the CIA to try to dissuade the FBI from investigating the burglary at the Watergate office building. That is absolutely an official act. And so under today's standard, the opinion decided yesterday, not only could President Nixon not have been charged for that order, you couldn't even use that as evidence. And so it really calls into question the consistency between yesterday's decision and the U.S. versus Nixon case, where the tapes were ordered to be turned over. If Nixon couldn't be charged with the crime, then how can you force him to turn over evidence of a crime that cannot be prosecuted? It really does, I think, put into stark relief just how questionable yesterday's decision really is. You know, one of my least favorite portions of the opinion is where Chief Justice